In 1931, 3 young girls set out on an extraordinary trek from the south of Australia to the north in order to get home. But these girls were not simply lost, they had been kidnapped and were part of the Stolen Generations, Aboriginal children who were forcibly removed from their homes and families by the government of Australia. Molly Craig, Daisy Barungu and Gracie Fields were all born in Jigalong in Western Australia. It was a remote Aboriginal community, and their mothers were part of the Martu people who lived there. Although originally the town was created in 1907 as a maintenance and rations store for workmen fixing the so-called rabbit-proof fence. This was a long fence officially called the State Barrier Fence of Western Australia, running from the north to the south in an attempt to keep rabbits and other agricultural pests in the east out of the pastoral areas of the west. The father of Molly Craig and Daisy Barungu, Thomas Craig, was an inspector working on the fence, and he was a white Australian. This shouldn't have been significant, except that by being mixed race, Molly and Daisy, along with their cousin Gracie, who also had a white father, came under Australian state policies that advocated the removal of mixed-raced Aboriginal children from their parents. In Western Australia, the Aborigines Act 1905 supposedly created to make provision for the better protection and care of the Aboriginal inhabitants of Western Australia, actually allowed the removal of Aboriginal children from their families. The position of Chief Protector of Aborigines was created, and the holder of this post became the legal guardian of every Aboriginal child in Western Australia until they were 16, later 21. It also gave them the power to take these children away from their families and send them to institutions or into work, usually poorly paid or unpaid. Mixed-race children were especially in danger. The exact reasons for removing these children are still argued over. The official reason given was the assimilation of mixed-raced Aboriginal children into the white population in order to improve their prospects. Already a dubious-sounding reason, the real concerns behind the act were much darker. The Chief Protector of Aborigines for Western Australia, Ober Octavius Neville, made no secret of the fact that he advocated a plan to breed out the colour, as he put it, to make successive generations of Aboriginal children marry into white families until their skin was lighter. It was a deliberate attempt to eradicate Aboriginal people from the Australian population. It's little wonder his nickname amongst those who feared his policies was Neville the Devil. When Molly was born to her mother Maud, she was a much-loved child from the start. Her mother and family doted on her, and her father gave her gifts of clothing and ribbons, as well as gifting necessary items to her family. She often felt out of place as the only mixed-race child in her community, but it wasn't long before she was joined by Gracie when she was around 3 years old, and Daisy arrived 3 years later when Molly was 6. The 3 girls were close, but it took a while for the other Martu children to warm to them, finding something different about them as children often do. Over time, the children all came to know one another, and any differences between them were superseded by what they shared. Unfortunately for them, other people were keeping a close eye on them and making the wrong conclusions. Mr. Keeling, the superintendent of the station at Jigalong, wrote to the Department of Native Affairs in Perth to tell them that he felt the 3 girls would be better off removed from the station due to how they were treated by the other children. Mrs. Cello from nearby Murramunda station also wrote, stating that she thought the 3 girls were running wild with the whites. The morning the girls were taken, in July 1931, started normally. They woke up with their stepfather, mother and their stepfather's second wife, and all prepared breakfast washed down with billy tea. Molly and Daisy offered to wash the clothes in the nearby river, but when they returned, there was an unwanted visitor to their camp. Constable Riggs, the so-named protector of Aborigines in the area, had come to take them to a camp in the north of Australia. Their families knew there was little they could do to fight against the laws that had been set up in their name, and their cries were ignored as the girls were taken away on horseback to the depot. There, they had to wait while Daisy was found with her family before the 3 of them were driven away in Riggs' car towards the Moore River native settlement. Their family members inflicted themselves with wounds as the girls were taken from them, a symbol of the deep mourning and loss they now had to bear. By the 26th of July, all 3 girls had been transferred to a ship taking them to Fremantle, where they would later be taken to Perth before their final destination. Most people were pleasant to them on their journey to the settlement, but upon arriving, the girls noticed things that sent alarm bells ringing. It was late when they arrived, and the place was shrouded in fine mist and light rain. After being handed over to a member of staff known as Miss Evans, Molly noticed that the dormitory they were led to was locked with chains and a padlock, as well as having bars on the window. The toilet was a bucket in the corner of the room, which was overcrowded with beds. This was not, as they had been told, a friendly place where they would simply be going to school. In the morning, all the girls in the dormitory were woken and told to make their beds, something that was easy as they only had a single blanket to spread over the mattress, with sheets only brought out if there were visitors. The 3 girls were then led by another friendly girl named Martha to breakfast, which was a poorly made meal of thin porridge, bread and dripping and tea. Their day seemed to improve when they were taken for a long walk around their new landscape by Martha and another girl named Polly, especially as the landscape was so different to their home, until they walked past something known as the Boob. This was a small corrugated iron building with little light or ventilation that the children would be locked up in as a punishment. For something as small as swearing, a girl was locked in there for 2 days. Those who tried to run away would be locked up for a week with only bread and water, and would have their heads shaven, as well as being beaten. Remembering that this place was meant to be a residential school for Aboriginal children, it seems even more horrific that it was set up like a prison. It wasn't long before Molly had decided Gracie, Daisy and herself were going to escape. The next morning, when they were supposed to make their way over to the schoolhouse for their first morning of education, Molly told her cousin and sister about her plan to escape. They could use the rabbit-proof fence to get home. The 3 girls would have had no knowledge of the area in which they now found themselves, the settlement being in a green, lush part of southern Australia which they had never travelled to. But they all knew that the fence ran from south to north, and if they followed it, they would eventually end up at Jigalong. They left quickly, running down towards the Moore River to find a place to cross. It was a grey, miserable day with thick clouds, but Molly still managed to work out the correct direction for the girls to travel in, having learned bushcraft from her stepfather and grandfather, and she had taken note of how they had travelled to the camp in the first place. They had to travel over slippery river mud for a long distance before coming out onto flat grassland. But they had bare feet and legs, and must have had to endure being scratched and injured by things lying on the ground as they ran. When night came, they had the smart idea of hiding and sleeping in a deserted rabbit burrow, digging it out enough that the three of them would fit. Molly also chose a rabbit burrow facing east, as she had noticed the rain came from the west over the coast, meaning the girls would be able to keep dry as well as warm. By the morning, although they still hadn't been caught, they were down to just some crust they had taken from the settlement before leaving, and water from a nearby pool. They were also shaken by seeing what they thought had been a mabu, a sharp-toothed evil spirit while hiding in the undergrowth of the trees around them, which in reality had probably just been an Aboriginal man who was a little hairier than usual and looking for shelter in the rain. The girls' imaginations, heightened by their escape attempt, had worked overtime. Gracie, as a result, became more reluctant to leave and wanted to return to the camp. They were lucky enough to run into two friendly Martu men who were out on a hunting trip. They gave the girls some cooked meat, matches, and a small box of salt, before warning them about an Aboriginal policeman who tracked runaways from the camp. It's likely the three girls would have struggled to survive easily without the help of these two men. They continued travelling along to look for a section of the fence to follow, only stopping at night to make shelters from trees and shrubs known as a wunku. So far, the three young girls had been covering an incredible 24 to 30 kilometres a day. At one point, they had to run and hide by climbing up a tree to avoid a search plane that had been sent out to try and spot them. Along the way, the girls began a pattern in order to survive on what food they could. Whenever they came to a farm or homestead, Daisy and Gracie would run in and ask for food, and thankfully, it was never refused. A few reported the girls over fears that they would not survive the harsh conditions, but always after giving them food and sometimes clothes for their journey. Help was a curious mix of a genuine desire to help three young girls who needed food and shelter, and a misplaced sense of what was right for these Aboriginal children. What the three girls didn't know was that by the 11th of August, a piece on them had appeared in the West Australian, a newspaper. It stated they had become timid of their new quarters at the settlement, and this was apparently the reason they had run away. They were now officially news. A few reports came in from those who had given them food, even giving descriptions of what the girls had been wearing, but thankfully they didn't know where they were heading. The girls by this stage were struggling a little. They had scratched their legs on the various shrubs and plants they had passed, and these had now become sores and were more painful than ever. They had also been travelling for a month and were only a few days ahead of several search teams that had been formed to find them. Daisy and Gracie found it difficult to keep up as their limbs hurt so badly, so Molly managed to carry them piggyback style for as long as she could along their journey. It must have been exhausting for them, but the thought of home can only have spurred them on ahead of their captors. Knowing now that some of the people helping to feed them on farms were also possible informants, the girls would leave in the opposite direction to where they wanted to go, before sneaking back and doubling on themselves to go the right way. Finally, after weeks of travelling, Molly, Daisy and Gracie found what they had been looking for, a section of the rabbit-proof fence. Molly recognised it easily, having learned enough about it from her father, who was of course an inspector for the fence. To the three girls, it was an arrow pointing them home to their families. They didn't know how far along they were, but the girls still had around 800 kilometers to travel before they were home, having only reached the halfway point. Just after this, they bumped into an Aboriginal man called Don Willocks, who worked at Pindathuna station. He shared his lunch with them and gave them a box of matches, but concerned about the condition of their legs, he reported the incident to his boss. The people they met along the way must have felt conflicted. On the one hand, something was bad enough that the girls wanted to leave where they were supposed to be safe in order to get home to their families. But on the other hand, they were only young girls. Daisy was only 8, and they seemed as though they might be in pain with their legs, and the Australian winters could be very difficult in the bush. By September, efforts to find the girls had been doubled, and Molly, Daisy and Gracie knew that although they were now in familiar surroundings, it was now too unsafe to even light a fire to cook on. By the time they reached Mount Russell Station and its railway siding, Gracie decided that she didn't want to continue on and went to speak with the people working at the station. One of them knew her mother and told Gracie that she had moved to Wiluna and that she could take Gracie there with her on the train. The other 2 girls were reluctant to let her go, but agreed that she could. So close to home, they became even more cautious, especially after Daisy had a confrontation with a mixed-race Aboriginal man who spotted them, throwing stones at him and swearing to make him leave. They made their way towards Station 594, as it was known, a cattle station along the Canning stock route. They had run out of most of their rations by this time, so the 2 girls had no idea what else to do but walk faster. But there was safety at the station, as Molly's stepfather's sister, her aunt, lived there. Finally, after around 9 weeks of travelling across the vast landscapes of Western Australia on just their bare feet, having evaded capture from several search parties, and surviving on food from farms and bush tucker, Daisy and Molly made it to their aunt's camp. She greeted them with open arms, fed them, and they must have felt safe for the first time in over 2 months. The next morning, after having a leisurely breakfast, the 2 girls joined the maintenance workers from the station, who were ready to take them along to Jigalong, letting them take turns riding on a camel rather than just walking. On the banks of the Jigalong Creek a few days later, the 2 men who had walked along with them, their cousin Joey and his boss Ron Clarkson, parted ways. And Uncle Freddie had already heard the news of the girls' return and had ridden ahead to tell their families. So when Daisy and Molly shyly made their way across the creek to their camp, their mothers were already waiting for them. Unsurprisingly, the girls and their families moved away from Jigalong the next day, disappearing into the bush where they would be less likely to be found. No one wanted to risk them being sent back to the Moore River native settlement. Correspondence continued between the authorities, who eventually all agreed that the girls were either nowhere near Jigalong or that they had, correctly, gone into the outback with their families and would be impossible to find. The final end to the search came in the form of a letter from the Commissioner of Aboriginal Affairs to Constable Riggs, which stated that Neville no longer wished to search for Molly as she has been a costly woman to the department. Very heavy expenditure was incurred in securing her, and when she decamped, a lot of undesirable publicity took place. A later letter confirmed that a search for Daisy would also be too expensive and too embarrassing for the government. Sadly for Gracie, she was caught again. After travelling to Uluna and finding she would have to wait for her mother, she was spotted by a policeman. After reporting her whereabouts, Gracie was identified despite giving the false name Lucy, and it was agreed that the wife of one of the sergeants at the station would escort Gracie back to the settlement at Moore River. She remained there, receiving her education and eventually being sent out as domestic help for nearby farms. She married a man called Harry Cross and had 6 children with him. Gracie passed away in 1983. She never made her way back to Jigalong. After Daisy made it home, she went with her family to the Jamal Bar goldfields before going on to a camp near Lake Nibiru. She later found work as a housemaid before marrying a station hand named Kadibil, and they had 4 children together. After moving to Kalundi Seventh-day Adventist Mission after her husband's death near Meekatharra, Daisy stayed there until the 70s, before moving back to Jigalong to be with her family. She passed away in 2018. And what of Molly? She trained as a domestic help at Balfour Downs Station, later finding work there, and her husband, Toby Kelly. She had 2 daughters, Doris and Annabelle. Doris would go on as an adult to write the story of their escape in the book Follow the Rabbit-Proof Fence. But on the 18th of November 1940, after undergoing surgery for appendicitis at the Royal Perth Hospital, a warrant was issued, and Molly, along with her daughters, was once again transported to the Moore River native settlement. It seemed someone had not forgotten her. Molly would later receive a letter from home informing her that some of her family members had died, one from self-inflicted wounds to her head the day Molly was taken again. Molly was refused permission to go back to Balfour Downs, where her husband and family were. Deciding she had no choice, Molly made the decision to leave 4-year-old Doris with a relative at the settlement, and once again made the same journey she had years before, carrying her other daughter with her, 18-month-old Annabelle. It must have been a heart-wrenching decision to make, but perhaps she hoped she might be able to get Doris back later in some way. Molly made her way back to Balfour Downs, but when Annabelle was just 3, she was taken away by the authorities and placed in the Sister Kate's Children's Home in Queen's Park. Annabelle was told she was an orphan, and the two would never see each other again. Doris was reunited with Molly 21 years later, and her story inspired Doris to write several books. Molly passed away in 2004. The story of these 3 girls is not just one of escape from enforced imprisonment in a place designed to train them as domestic help or farm labourers, but one of Australia's hidden stories, that of the stolen generations. Their story highlights the agony and grief of Aboriginal families all over Australia who lost their children, sometimes never being reunited with them. The loss of land to people who took it for themselves during the era of empire building is a hard enough thing to bear, but the loss of generations of children and family that went on until the 1970s will be a deep scar that must be mended, and this goes on in modern Australia through the work of organisations to help heal the trauma of these events and trying to reconnect them with what was lost. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss any new documentaries.